You think a warship is crewed by soldiers. It's not. It's crewed by fuel. The Glory of Sol has been flying for 700 years, and somewhere in the lower decks, the bodies of every man who ever served are still plugged into the walls. They're not dead. They're part of the ship now, and if you serve long enough, you will be too. I learned the truth about service on my 16th day aboard the Glory of Sol, when I found the first body folded into the conduit housing like a prayer pressed between pages. My name is Corvin Hale, and I was assigned to the Glory of Sol as a junior voidrigger 3 months after my 18th birthday, which means I had already survived longer than most boys pulled from the Cipra Hive recruitment tithes. The battleship was a Mars-forged Leviathan, 10 kilometers of iron and faith wrapped around a core so old that the tech priests whispered its keel had been laid during the founding of the Segmentum Solar itself. When I first saw it through the viewport of the personnel lighter, hanging in the black like a cathedral someone had launched into the stars and forgotten to call back, I felt something I mistook for pride. That feeling lasted exactly as long as it took for the lighter to dock, for the pressure doors to hiss open, and for the smell to reach me. It was not the stink of unwashed bodies or recycled air, though both were present. It was the scent of oil older than my bloodline, of incense burned in quantities that suggested desperation rather than reverence, of metal that had been heated and cooled so many times it had developed its own mineral breath. Underneath it all was something else, something I would not have words for until much later. The smell of a place that consumed people the way a forge consumes coal, steadily and without preference. The deck officer who processed my assignment was a woman named Corvash, a void born with skin so pale it looked like parchment stretched over bone, and she spoke without looking at me as she branded my left forearm with the crew designation mark. The last brander hissed, and I bit down on my tongue hard enough to taste copper. But she continued speaking in that same flat monotone, explaining that I would be assigned to Subdeck 9, Compartment Tertius, under Ganga Volk, that my shift rotation was 8 hours labor, 4 hours rest, 8 hours labor, 4 hours rest, cycling without cessation except for mandated prayer observances and nutrition allotment, and that failure to report for shift constituted dereliction, punishable by flogging or worse, depending on the mood of the ship's commissariat. She told me all of this while the flesh of my arm was still smoking, and when she finally looked at me, her eyes were the color of dirty ice. "Welcome aboard the Glory of Sol," she said. "The Emperor protects." I repeated the phrase because it was expected, and she handed me a data slate with my bunk assignment and dismissed me with a gesture that suggested I had already ceased to exist in her awareness. I learned quickly that this was how officers regarded the riggers, as components, as interchangeable parts in a vast mechanism whose true function we were never meant to understand. We were the hands that reached into spaces too small for servitors, the bodies that could be sent into radiation-flooded compartments with nothing but rebreather masks and the promise of the Emperor's mercy, the eyes that checked welds and seals in the dark places where the ship's machine spirit grew restless and hungry. Subdeck 9 was 17 levels below the primary habitat decks, accessible only through a series of vertical shafts that required climbing in near-total darkness, because the lumen strips had failed decades ago and no one had bothered to replace them. The first time I made the descent, following the flickering glow marker painted by some long-dead rigger on the ladder rungs, I counted 412 rungs before my boots hit solid deck plating. The air down there was 10 degrees colder than the upper decks, and it moved in strange patterns, gusting from vents that should have been sealed and falling still in corridors that should have had active circulation. I learned to read those air currents the way a sailor reads the sea, because they told you things the official deck plans did not, where the ship's skeleton was cracked and weeping atmosphere, where the machine spirit's attention was focused, where the temperature differentials meant a plasma conduit was running too hot, or a coolant line had developed a slow leak that would eventually kill everyone in the compartment. Ganga Volk was a bull of a man, gene-bulked and augmented with enough bionics that his left arm whined when he moved it, and his right eye glowed a faint red in the darkness. He looked at me the way a man looks at a tool he expects to break, and his first words to me were a question. "Can you read Gothic script?" I told him I could, that I had been taught in the Schola on Cipra, and he grunted and handed me a leather-bound manual so old the pages crumbled at the edges when I opened it. "This," he said, "is the Rigger's Catechism. You will memorize the first 12 cantos before your next shift. You will learn the litany of acceptable pressure variance and the prayer of seal integrity. You will understand that this ship is not a machine, it is a living temple, and we are the monks who tend its needs. Fail to show proper reverence, and the glory will kill you. Fail to perform your duties, and I will kill you. Do you understand?" I said I did, though I understood nothing, and he assigned me a bunk in a compartment that housed 23 other riggers, most of them older than me by a decade or more, most of them bearing the scars and augmetics that came from years of service in the bowels of an Imperial warship. My bunk was a shelf of metal 18 inches wide, with a thin mattress that smelled of mildew and a blanket that had been patched so many times it was more thread than fabric. Above me, someone had scratched a series of marks into the metal, hundreds of them, arranged in groups of 5. I did not ask what they represented. I already knew. The first week was an education in pain. Volk sent me into crawl spaces barely wide enough for my shoulders, into conduit tunnels where the heat was enough to blister exposed skin, into ventilation shafts, where the air was so thin I had to work in 30-second intervals before retreating to gasp and recover. I learned to move in the dark by touch alone, to identify different types of cabling by the texture of their insulation, to distinguish the healthy hum of a functional plasma relay from the stuttering whine that meant imminent failure. I learned that the ship made sounds no schematic could account for, groaning deep in its superstructure like a beast in pain, chiming from empty compartments where no bells existed, whispering in the vents that almost sounded like voices if you listened long enough. I learned not to listen. The other riggers taught me the unwritten rules, the ones that kept you alive when the official regulations failed. Never work alone in the starboard tertiary coolant manifold, because the machine spirit there was malevolent and had crushed 3 men in the past year by closing blast doors that should have been mechanically locked open. Never touch the brass plating in Subdeck 7 because it carried a charge that the tech priests insisted was impossible but which had stopped the heart of a rigger named Corso just 2 months prior. Never look directly at the servitors in the reclamation bay, because some of them still had enough human awareness left to recognize pity, and pity made them scream. I learned that the Glory of Sol had been in active service for 700 years, that it had fought in campaigns whose names I had never heard, that its kill tally included 2 Orc cruisers, 1 Chaos Raider, and something the older riggers called the Weeping Vessel, which they would not describe except to say that the compartments where its survivors had been quarantined were still sealed and would remain so until the ship itself died. I learned that the battleship's crew numbered somewhere between 15 and 20,000 souls, though no one knew the exact figure because the personnel records were maintained by servitors who had begun to corrupt their own data decades ago, duplicating some names and erasing others, so that men who had died in the line of duty still appeared on shift rosters, while living riggers found themselves listed as deceased and had to fight the administratum for months to reclaim their rations. I learned that time moved differently in the deep decks, that shifts which should have lasted 8 hours somehow stretched to 10 or 12, that rest periods vanished into moments of confused half-sleep where you could not remember lying down or waking up. The chronometers in Subdeck 9 disagreed with each other by margins of up to 3 hours, and when I asked Volk about it, he told me to stop asking questions that had no useful answers. "The machine spirit feels time differently than we do," he said. "Learn its rhythms or die confused." On my 16th day aboard, I was sent to repair a pressure seal in a section of Subdeck 9 that I had never accessed before, a long corridor marked on my data slate as Compartment Tertius Secundus 9, which made no grammatical sense, but which I had learned to accept as typical of the ship's labyrinthine designations. The corridor was narrow, barely wide enough for 2 men to pass each other, and the walls were lined with conduits that pulsed with a faint bioluminescent glow, as if something alive moved through them. The air tasted of copper and ozone, and my breath fogged despite the fact that my suit's temperature sensor insisted the ambient temperature was well within habitable range. The seal I was meant to repair was located at the far end of the corridor, where it dead-ended into a bulkhead that had been welded shut and then covered with purity seals so old the wax had turned black. I approached it with my tool satchel and my lumen lamp, and I was 3 meters away when I noticed the smell. It was the smell of old death, of flesh that had desiccated rather than rotted, of bone and dried sinew, and the particular mineral stink of a body that had been exposed to hard vacuum and then sealed away from air and light. I stopped walking. My lumen lamp flickered, and in that moment of strobing illumination, I saw the conduit housing to my right, and I saw what was folded inside it. A man's body, or what remained of one, compressed into the narrow space between 2 coolant pipes like a letter pressed into an envelope. The void suit was still intact, though the faceplate had cracked, and through that crack I could see the desiccated face beneath, mouth open in a silent scream, eyes sunken to pits. The name stenciled on the suit's chest plate read Hark, and beneath it was a crew designation I did not recognize. I stood there for a long time, lamp shaking in my hand, waiting for my training to tell me what to do. Report it to Volk. Log it with the deck officer. Seal the compartment and mark it for reclamation services. But none of those responses felt adequate, because this was not an accident, not a forgotten casualty of some past crisis. This body had been placed here, folded carefully into a space designed to hold it, and the conduit housing had been sealed afterward with fresh welds I could see gleaming in the lamplight. Someone had put Hark in the walls. Someone had hidden him there on purpose. And the rest of the ship had continued functioning around him, circulating air and coolant through pipes that pressed against his ribs, routing power through cables that lay across his folded legs. I backed away slowly, and I did not repair the pressure seal. I returned to the compartment, and I told Volk what I had found, and he listened without expression and then told me to forget it. "You saw a dead rigger in the infrastructure," he said. "That is not unusual. The ship takes what it needs." I asked him what he meant, and he looked at me with his one human eye and his one augmetic eye, and there was something in his expression that might have been pity or might have been contempt. "The glory of Sol is 700 years old," he said. "Do you think we eject every body? Do you think we perform full funeral rites for every man who dies in the deep decks? We are 17 levels below the primary hull. The dead stay where they fall, or where the ship decides to keep them. You will see more before your service ends. Learn to step over them." That night I lay in my bunk and listened to the sounds of the ship, and I understood for the first time that I was not aboard a vessel, I was inside a living tomb that had learned to fly. The glory of Sol entered warp transit on my 32nd day of service, and everything changed. I had been warned about the warp by the scholar instructors, told that it was a realm of madness and horror, that the Jella field was all that stood between the crew and an eternity of torment, that prayer and vigilance were our only weapons against the entities that hungered beyond the skin of reality. What they had not told me was how the ship itself would respond, how the machine's spirit would twist and adapt to the pressures of the Imperium, how the deep decks would begin to shift in ways that had nothing to do with standard reconfiguration protocols. The first sign was the air. It grew thicker, almost syrupy, and it carried a taste like burnt sugar and spoiled milk. The second sign was the lights. The lumen strips began to flicker in patterns, cycling through sequences that seemed almost intentional, almost like code. The third sign was the corridors themselves, which began to terminate in places they had not terminated before, to branch into access ways that did not appear on any schematic, to loop back on themselves in geometries that made my eyes ache when I tried to follow them. Volk called it the shift cycle. He explained it during a rare moment of downtime, when the rest of the riggers were sleeping and the two of us were performing a routine inspection of the primary coolant manifold. "The ship has moods," he said. "In real space, it is stable. In the warp, it dreams. And when it dreams, the decks rearrange themselves according to logics we do not understand. You will learn to navigate by feel, by instinct. Trust your gut more than your maps. The maps lie. The ship does not." I asked him if the officers knew about this, and he laughed, a sound like grinding metal. "The officers live in the upper decks," he said. "They see what the ship wants them to see. Down here, we see the truth." The shift cycles were not random. I began to notice patterns, repetitions, as if the ship were testing configurations and then returning to them days later. Corridors that had been sealed would open, revealing compartments full of equipment I did not recognize, machinery that hummed with a frequency that made my teeth ache. Bulkheads that had been welded shut for decades would suddenly unlock, and beyond them would be spaces that smelled of ozone and copper. Spaces where the walls were covered in symbols I did not know, scratched into the metal by hands I would never see. I began to keep a journal, written in a small notebook I had found in the bunk of a rigger who had died 3 weeks before I arrived, a man named Tech, whose name was still on the shift roster, despite the fact that his body had been fed to the reclamation servitors. In the journal, I recorded the shift cycles, mapping the changes as best I could, trying to find the pattern, the underlying logic. I noted the times when certain corridors would appear, the sounds that preceded reconfigurations, the smells that indicated a shift was imminent. On the 47th day, I discovered the ghost echo alarms. I was alone in a subcompartment of Deck 9, replacing a blown relay in a power junction when I heard the klaxon. It was a standard proximity alarm, the kind that sounded when a blast door was about to close or when a pressure differential exceeded safe parameters. I looked up, expecting to see warning lights, expecting to hear the automated voice of the ship's Vox system announcing the nature of the emergency. But there was nothing. No lights, no voice, just the klaxon, echoing through the empty corridor, growing louder and then fading, as if it were moving away from me. I followed it. I know now that this was a mistake, that I should have returned to the compartment, should have reported it to Volk, should have done anything other than what I did. But I was young, and I was curious, and I had not yet learned that curiosity in the deep decks was a form of slow suicide. I followed the sound through 3 corridors, down a shaft I had never seen before, into a section of the ship that my data slate insisted did not exist. The corridor ended in a chamber, circular and vast, easily 50 meters across, with a ceiling that vanished into shadow above my head. The walls were covered in pipes, thousands of them, ranging from finger-width tubing to conduits large enough to crawl through, and they pulsed with a rhythm that was almost biological, almost like a heartbeat. In the center of the chamber was a structure I did not recognize, a cylindrical column of brass and iron, covered in engraved prayers and purity seals, and from its top extended a series of cables that rose into the darkness above. The klaxon was coming from the column. It sounded once, twice, 3 times, and then it stopped, and in the silence that followed, I heard something else. Breathing. Not the mechanical wheeze of a ventilation system, but the slow, deliberate breath of something living, something massive, something that filled the chamber with its presence. I stood frozen, lamp clutched in one hand, waiting for whatever it was to reveal itself. But nothing moved. The breathing continued, steady and patient, and after a long moment, I realized that it was coming from the pipes themselves, from the entire chamber, from the ship. The glory of Sol was breathing. I ran. I do not remember the route I took, do not remember climbing back up the shaft or navigating the corridors. I remember only the sound of that breathing following me, echoing in the vents, and the certainty that I had seen something I was not meant to see, that I had stepped into a space reserved for the ship's dreaming mind, and that I had been marked by it. When I returned to the compartment, Volk was waiting. He looked at me, at my pale face and shaking hands, and he nodded as if he had expected this. "You heard it," he said. It was not a question. I told him about the chamber, about the column, about the breathing, and he listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was silent for a long time, and then he said, "That is the Sanctum Tertius. It is one of the ship's hearts. There are 7 of them, scattered through the deep decks, and each one maintains a different function. Plasma regulation, atmosphere cycling, warp field stabilization. The Sanctum Tertius regulates the shift cycles. It decides when the decks reconfigure. It is the ship's will made manifest." I asked him why the officers did not know about it, and he gave me a look that suggested I was being deliberately obtuse. "The officers know everything they need to know," he said. "We know what we need to survive. Those are not the same thing." Over the following weeks, I began to understand what he meant. The officers lived in a different ship than we did. a vessel of clean corridors and functioning lights, of order and discipline and the illusion of control. In the deep decks, we lived in the ship's truth, in the spaces where its machine spirit was unfiltered and raw, where the boundaries between metal and flesh had begun to blur. I saw servitors that wept oil from their optical sensors. I saw cables that bled when they were cut. I saw bulkheads that contracted and expanded like lungs, and I saw conduits that grew new connections overnight, as if the ship were rewiring itself according to needs it did not share with its crew. And I saw the bodies. They were everywhere once I learned to look for them. Folded into wall cavities, sealed behind access panels, suspended in coolant tanks with their mouths open and their eyes wide. Some were recent, still wearing void suits with crew designations I recognized. Others were ancient, reduced to skeletons held together by scraps of cloth and the metal fittings of their augmetics. The ship kept them all, incorporated them into its structure, and in some cases I swear I could see them still moving, fingers twitching, heads turning slowly to track my passage through the corridors. Volk told me not to speak of it, told me that acknowledging the dead would give them power, would draw their attention in ways that could not be undone. So I learned to walk past them without looking, to ignore the whispers that seemed to come from sealed compartments, to focus on my work and my survival, and nothing else. But the ship would not let me forget. On the 63rd day, a rigger named Pallas disappeared. He was on shift with me, working to replace a corroded seal in one of the tertiary coolant lines, and I turned away for less than a minute to retrieve a tool from my satchel. When I turned back, he was gone. His tools were still on the deck. His void suit hung on the wall hook where he had left it, but Pallas himself had vanished, as if he had simply ceased to exist in the space between one breath and the next. I reported it immediately, and Volk organized a search, but we found nothing. No body, no signs of struggle, no indication that he had ever been there except for the tools and the suit and the faint smell of his sweat lingering in the air. The deck officer logged it as a desertion, and Pallas's name was struck from the roster, and the ship continued its transit as if nothing had happened. But 3 days later, I found him. I was crawling through a ventilation shaft in Subdeck 8, following a maintenance route that should have terminated in a filter station when I heard a sound ahead of me, a wet, rhythmic sound, like someone chewing. I stopped, lamp raised, and I saw the shaft ahead branching into a space that should not have existed, a cavity in the ship's structure where the walls were lined with something that looked like flesh, red and glistening, and veined with black capillaries. And in the center of that space, suspended by cables that entered his body through his back and his shoulders and his thighs, was Pallas. He was still alive. His eyes moved, tracking my approach, and his mouth worked as if he were trying to speak, but no sound came out except for a low, continuous moan. The cables pulsed, and I could see fluid moving through them, draining from his body and then pumping back in. And I understood with a horror that made my vision narrow and my hands shake that the ship was feeding on him, that it had taken him and plugged him into its own circulatory system, and that it was keeping him alive for reasons I could not begin to comprehend. I tried to reach him, tried to pull the cables free, but they would not budge, and when I touched them, they were warm and slick, and they pulsed under my fingers like living things. Pallas's eyes met mine, and I saw recognition there, and I saw pleading, and I saw something else, something that might have been resignation or might have been relief. I could not save him. I did not have the tools, did not have the strength, did not have the knowledge. So I did the only thing I could do. I whispered the prayer for the dying, the one my mother had taught me before the tithe takers came for me, and I watched as something in Pallas's eyes went still, as if he had heard me and understood and let go. Then I crawled backward out of the shaft, and I sealed the access hatch, and I told no one what I had seen. That night, lying in my bunk with the sounds of the ship groaning around me, I understood that the glory of Sol did not simply contain the dead, it consumed them. It took their bodies and their minds and their memories, and it folded them into itself, sustaining its own vast and ancient life with the remnants of those who served it. We were not crew, we were fuel. The warp transit stretched on, days bleeding into weeks, weeks into months, until I lost count and stopped trying to keep track. The shift cycles grew more frequent, more erratic, and entire sections of Subdeck 9 began to vanish from the schematics, replaced by notations that read under reconfiguration or awaiting tech-priced approval, which everyone understood to mean that the ship had claimed those spaces for itself and no longer permitted human access. More riggers disappeared. Vento, Marek, a woman named Shay who had survived 8 years in the deep decks and who should have known better than to work alone. Their names were struck from the roster, their bunks reassigned, and the rest of us continued our shifts as if they had never existed, because to do otherwise was to acknowledge the truth, and the truth was unendurable. I began to have dreams, or what I thought were dreams, though I was never certain I was actually asleep when they came. I would see the corridors of the ship stretching out before me, endless and branching, and I would walk them for hours, days, passing chambers filled with machinery I did not recognize, passing servitors that stood motionless and watched me with eyes that glowed the same red as Volk's augmetic, passing bodies sealed into the walls like saints in a cathedral's reliquary. And at the end of each dream, I would find the same chamber, the circular room with the brass column and the pulsing pipes, and I would hear the breathing, and I would understand that the ship was calling me, that it wanted something from me, though I did not know what. Volk noticed the change in me. He pulled me aside during a rest period and asked if I was sleeping, if I was eating, if I was maintaining my observances. I told him I was, though it was a lie, and he studied me with his mismatched eyes and then said, "The ship is testing you. It does this to some. It did it to me years ago. You will either break or you will adapt. There is no third option." I asked him what happened if I broke, and he smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "Then you will join the others," he said, "and the ship will keep you alive just long enough to learn that you should have adapted." On what I believed was the 97th day of warp transit, though I could no longer trust my count, I was assigned to a work detail in a section of Subdeck 9 that I had never accessed, a place marked on the schematics as Compartment Ossuary Prime. The name alone should have warned me, but I was beyond warnings, beyond fear, existing in a state of numb functionality that was the only way to survive in the deep decks. The compartment was located at the end of a long corridor that sloped downward at an angle that made my knees ache, and the air there was colder than anywhere else I had been, cold enough that my breath came out in thick plumes and my fingers grew stiff inside my gloves. The hatch was marked with purity seals and warning sigils, and it required 3 separate authorization codes to unlock, codes that Volk provided without explanation. Beyond the hatch was a chamber that defied my understanding of the ship's architecture. It was vast, easily 100 meters long and half as wide, and the ceiling was so high that my lamp could not reach it. The walls were lined with alcoves, thousands of them, arranged in neat rows like the catacombs beneath the great hive cathedrals, and in each alcove was a body. They were void crew, all of them, still wearing their suits and their rank insignia, still strapped into their duty harnesses. Some were recent enough that I could see the color in their faces through the helmet visors. Others were ancient, reduced to bones and scraps of cloth, their suits corroded to lace. And all of them were connected to the ship by cables that entered their suits through ports I had never seen on any standard void gear, cables that pulsed with the same bioluminescent glow I had seen in the conduits, as if the ship were still sustaining them, still feeding them, still keeping some spark of life trapped in their desiccated flesh. I stood in the entrance, lamp shaking in my hand, and I counted the alcoves. There were thousands, tens of thousands, enough to account for every rigger who had ever served aboard the Glory of Sol, every void crew member who had died in its service, every soul the ship had claimed and refused to release. "This is where we go," said a voice behind me, and I turned to find Volk standing in the hatchway, his expression unreadable. "This is the ship's memory. Every man who dies in the deep decks is brought here, connected to the infrastructure, preserved. The tech priests say it is to honor the fallen, to maintain continuity with the ship's past. But we know the truth." I asked him what the truth was, and he stepped into the chamber, walking between the rows of alcoves, running his augmetic hand along the cables. "The truth is that the glory of Sol does not forget," he said. "It does not forgive. It does not release. When you die here, you become part of it, and it will keep you alive in whatever way it can, feeding on your thoughts, your memories, your pain. Some of these men have been here for centuries. Some of them are still conscious." "Do you understand what I am telling you, Hale?" I told him I did, though I understood nothing except the magnitude of the horror before me, and he nodded and turned to leave. "Our work detail is to repair the coolant lines that service this compartment," he said. "The ship must keep its memory cold, or the bodies will decay, and it will lose them. We have 6 hours. Do not touch the cables. Do not speak to the bodies, and do not look too closely at their faces, because some of them will recognize you, and that recognition will damn you." We worked in silence, Volk and I and 3 other riggers whose names I did not know, replacing corroded fittings and sealing leaks in the coolant system that kept the ossuary cold. The entire time, I was aware of the bodies watching us, or the bodies that still had eyes to watch with, and I was aware of the cables pulsing, and I was aware of the ship breathing around us, and I understood that this chamber was not an exception, not an aberration. It was the rule. This was what the glory of Sol did to everyone who served it. This was the fate that awaited all of us. When the work was complete, we sealed the hatch and returned to the upper sections of Subdeck 9, and Volk dismissed the other riggers and pulled me aside. "You asked me once what happens if you break," he said. "Now you know. You become one of them. But there is a way to avoid it, a way to ensure that when you die cleanly, that the ship does not claim you. Do you want to know what it is?" I said yes, because I was desperate, because I had seen the ossuary, and I knew I would rather die in any other way than end up in one of those alcoves. And Volk leaned close and whispered, "You recite the litany of submission," he said. "You speak it alone, in a place where the ship cannot hear you, and you offer yourself willingly, and if you mean it, if you truly submit, the ship will take you quickly and will not preserve you. It is the only mercy it knows." He gave me a copy of the litany, written on a scrap of parchment so old it felt like skin, and he told me to memorize it, to keep it close, and to use it only when I was certain that death was inevitable. Then he walked away, leaving me alone in the corridor with the parchment in my hand and the knowledge that I had been given a weapon I prayed I would never need to use. The warp storm hit on what I think was the 103rd day, though by then I had stopped keeping track, had stopped trusting the chronometers, had stopped believing that time in the deep decks bore any relation to time in the rest of the Imperium. It began with a sound, a low thrumming that vibrated through the hull, through the deck plating, through my bones. The lumen strips flickered and went dark, plunging the corridors into absolute blackness, and then they came back on, but wrong, casting a sickly purple light that made everything look diseased. The air grew thick, almost liquid, and it tasted of ash and burnt copper, and I could hear voices in the vents, whispering in languages I did not know, chanting in rhythms that made my head ache. The shift cycles accelerated. Corridors that had been stable for weeks suddenly terminated in blank walls. Hatches that had been sealed opened onto spaces that had not existed moments before. I saw alcoves appear in the middle of walls, saw bodies tumble out of them, ancient and desiccated, clattering to the deck like broken dolls. I saw servitors malfunction, tearing at their own faces with their manipulator claws, screaming binary cant that resolved into pleas for death. I saw cables writhe like serpents, saw bulkheads bleed, saw lumen strips pulse in time with a heartbeat that was not my own. And the crew began to disappear faster, not just riggers now, but gangers, deck officers, even a tech priest who had come down to perform a routine blessing and who vanished between one prayer and the next, leaving behind only his mechadendrites, which continued to twitch on the deck for hours afterward. The roster was meaningless. The shift rotations collapsed. We worked when we could, slept when exhaustion forced us, and tried not to think about the fact that the ship was consuming us at a rate that suggested it was preparing for something, gathering strength, feeding itself in anticipation of an effort whose nature we could not guess. Volk grew quiet. He stopped assigning work details, stopped enforcing the regulations, stopped pretending that any of this was normal or survivable. He spent his time in the compartment, sitting on his bunk, staring at nothing, and when I asked him what was happening, he looked at me with eyes that had gone dull and said, "The ship is waking up. We are in the deep warp now, and it is dreaming, and its dreams are hungry. Stay close to the compartment, do not wander, and if you hear your name spoken in the vents, do not answer, because it is not your name anymore. It is the ship learning to call you." I tried to follow his advice, tried to stay in the compartment, but the ship would not allow it. The Vox would summon me to phantom work assignments, to corridors that did not exist, to chambers where I would find nothing but darkness and the sound of breathing. I would return to the compartment hours later, or days later, with no memory of the time between, with my tools missing and my hands covered in oil I did not remember touching. I began to see the others, the ones who had disappeared. Pallas, still suspended in the ventilation shaft, his eyes following me as I passed. Shay, standing at the end of a corridor, her void suit torn open and her chest cavity filled with cables. Vento, sealed into a bulkhead, his face pressed against the metal, his mouth moving in silent screams. They were everywhere, woven into the ship's structure, and I understood that they were not dead, not truly, that the ship had claimed them and was keeping them alive in states that mocked the very concept of life, and that I would join them soon if I did not find a way to escape. But there was no escape. The glory of Sol was in warp transit, and even if I could reach the upper decks, even if I could find a way to the shuttle bays or the savior pods, there was nowhere to go, nothing beyond the Geller field except the howling madness of the Imperium. So I did the only thing I could do. I memorized the litany of submission. I spoke it to myself during the long hours of work, whispered it in the darkness of my bunk, repeated it until the words lost meaning and became simply sounds, rhythms, a mantra against the encroaching horror. I do not know if I believed it would save me. I do not know if I believed anything by that point, but it gave me something to focus on, something to hold on to, and that was enough. The end came on a day I cannot number, in a corridor I cannot name, in a moment that felt both sudden and inevitable. I was alone, crawling through a maintenance tunnel that had not existed the day before, following a false alarm that the Vox had given me when the walls began to contract. It was slow at first, a gradual narrowing that I barely noticed, but within minutes the tunnel had shrunk to the point where I could no longer turn around, could barely move forward, and I understood with a clarity that cut through my exhaustion and my fear that the ship was closing around me, that it had decided to claim me, and that I had perhaps 60 seconds before I would be crushed or absorbed or transformed into something that was no longer recognizably human. I stopped crawling. I lay still in the narrowing darkness, feeling the metal pressing against my back and my shoulders and my skull, and I began to recite the litany of submission. "I submit to the glory of Sol," I whispered. "I submit to its will and its needs. I offer myself willingly, without reservation, without fear. I am a servant of the Imperium, a child of the Emperor, and I give my flesh and my spirit to the machine that carries his light into the void. Let my death be swift. Let my service be remembered. Let the ship take what it needs and release what it does not." I spoke the words clearly, slowly, meaning every syllable, and I felt something shift in the tunnel around me. The pressure eased. The walls stopped contracting, and in the silence that followed, I heard a sound that might have been the ship breathing, or might have been something else, something that recognized my submission and accepted it. The tunnel widened, just enough for me to crawl forward, and I emerged into a corridor I recognized, one of the main arteries of Subdeck 9, and I stood on shaking legs and looked around and understood that I had been tested and that I had passed or failed or simply survived, and that the distinction no longer mattered. I made my way back to the compartment, and I found it empty. Every bunk was stripped, every locker was open and bare. The other riggers were gone, Volk was gone, and I was alone in a space that smelled of oil and incense, and the particular chemical tang of fear sweat dried into metal. I sat on my bunk, the one with the tally mark scratched into the frame above it, and I added one more mark, and then I lay down and closed my eyes and waited for the ship to tell me what came next. The Glory of Sol exited warp transit 17 days later, or 17 hours, or 17 weeks. Time had ceased to have meaning, and I had ceased to trust my perceptions. The transition was violent, a lurching shudder that threw me from my bunk and sent tools and equipment clattering across the deck. And for a moment I thought the ship was tearing itself apart, that the Geller field had failed, and the warp was flooding in. But then the emergency lumen strips activated, bathing the compartment in clean white light, and I heard the Vox crackle to life, and a voice I did not recognize announced that we had successfully translated to real space, and that all hands were to report to their duty stations for post-transit inspections. I stood slowly, testing my legs, and I made my way to the corridor, and I found it transformed. The walls were clean, the lumen strips functional, the air fresh and cool. The shift cycles had stopped, the ghosts were gone, the ship had returned to its normal configuration, or what passed for normal, and it was as if the long nightmare of the warp transit had never happened. I climbed the 17 levels to the upper decks, and I reported to the deck officer, a different woman than the one who had processed my arrival, and she looked at me with mild surprise and asked where I had been for the past 3 months. I told her I had been in Subdeck 9, performing my duties, and she frowned and consulted her data slate and told me that, according to the records, I had not logged a single shift in over 90 days, that I was listed as a deserter, and that I should consider myself fortunate that the commissariat had more pressing concerns, or I would be facing summary execution. I did not argue. I accepted the reprimand, accepted the docked pay, accepted the notations on my service record, and I returned to Subdeck 9 and resumed my shifts as if nothing had happened. But everything had happened. The other riggers had returned, or new riggers had been assigned. I could not tell which. Volk was still the ganger, still gave orders in the same flat monotone, still looked at me with his mismatched eyes, but when I asked him about the warp transit, about the shift cycles, about the disappearances, he stared at me as if I had lost my mind and told me that the transit had been routine, that we had lost only 2 riggers to accidents, and that I should stop inventing problems where none existed. I checked the roster. Pallas was listed as active duty. Shay was scheduled for a shift in Subdeck 7. Vento had been promoted to assistant ganger. The ossuary was not on any schematic. The Sanctum Tertius did not exist. I understood then that the ship had 2 faces, 2 realities, and that which one you saw depended on what the ship wanted you to see, on what the machine spirit decided to reveal. In real space, the Glory of Sol was a functioning warship, ancient but serviceable, crewed by loyal servants of the Imperium. In the warp, it was something else, something that fed on its crew and folded them into itself and kept them alive in states that defied comprehension. And I had seen both faces, had survived both realities, and the ship had marked me for it. Over the following weeks, I tried to return to normal, tried to perform my duties and ignore the memories, but I could not unsee what I had seen. I would pass through corridors and see the faint outlines of alcoves that were not there, would hear whispers in the vents that no one else acknowledged, would smell the copper and ozone scent that meant the shift cycles were beginning, even though the ship remained stable and the chronometers agreed with each other and the schematics stayed constant. I began to understand that I was living in both realities simultaneously, that the ship's mark had given me a kind of double vision, and that I would never be free of it. The deep decks would always be there, just beneath the surface, waiting for the next warp transit, waiting to reclaim the crew it had temporarily released. I kept the litany of submission in my pocket, written on the scrap of parchment Volk had given me, and I read it every night before I slept, reminding myself of the bargain I had made, the submission I had offered. I did not know if it would protect me. I did not know if anything could protect me, but it was the only weapon I had, and I clung to it the way a drowning man clings to driftwood. The months passed, or what I perceived as months, and the Glory of Sol continued its patrol, translating in and out of warp space, engaging in skirmishes I never saw, conducting operations I was never briefed on. My service record grew, notations accumulating like scars, and I learned to exist in a state of constant low-level dread, waiting for the next transit, waiting for the ship to wake up and remember me. On what I believe was my 247th day of service, I was summoned to the bridge. It was an unprecedented honor or punishment. I could not tell which. Riggers did not go to the bridge. Riggers remained in the deep decks, invisible and expendable, and the fact that I had been called up suggested that something had gone very wrong or very right. I climbed through the ship, passing through sections I had never seen, through corridors lined with purity seals and gold leaf, through chapels where servitor cherubs sang endless hymns, through armories where weapons larger than my entire compartment hung in blessed racks. The ship above Subdeck 9 was a different world, clean and ordered and lit with the warm glow of brass lumen globes, and I felt like an intruder, like something foul that had crawled up from the bilges into a cathedral. The bridge was a vast chamber, cathedral-like in its proportions, with viewports that showed the star field beyond and command thrones where officers sat in states of constant communion with the ship's systems. In the center of it all was the captain, a man so heavily augmented that he seemed more machine than flesh, his body wired into a command throne that fed him data through cables that entered his spine and his skull. He did not look at me as I was brought before him. He was studying a hololith display that showed the ship's systems, and I could see Subdeck 9 rendered in glowing lines, could see the compartments and corridors I knew so well, and I could see, overlaid on the standard schematic, a second pattern, a ghost image that showed the shift cycles, the hidden chambers, the ossuary. The captain saw both faces of the ship. He had always seen them. "You are Rigger Corvin Hale," he said, his voice a mechanical rasp filtered through vox grills. "You have served aboard the Glory of Sol for 247 days. You have logged 163 shifts. You have survived 1 warp transit. You have submitted to the ship." I confirmed that this was accurate, and he finally turned to look at me, and his eyes were augmetic, glowing the same red as Volk's, and I understood that everyone who served the ship long enough received that same modification, that same mark. "The ship has chosen you," he said. "It has tested you and found you acceptable. You will be promoted to Ganger, assigned to Subdeck 7, and you will oversee a crew of 16 riggers. You will teach them what you have learned. You will prepare them for the next transit. Do you accept this honor?" I wanted to refuse. I wanted to tell him that I did not want the responsibility, did not want to become another Volk, did not want to spend the rest of my life in the deep decks watching men disappear and pretending it was normal. But I had submitted, and submission meant acceptance, meant obedience, meant that my will was no longer my own. "I accept," I said, and the captain nodded and dismissed me with a gesture, and I was escorted back down through the ship, past the chapels and the armories and the clean corridors, down into the deep decks, down to Subdeck 7, where a compartment of 16 riggers waited for their new ganger, where bunks had been prepared and tools had been issued, and the cycle was beginning again. Volk was there, waiting for me at the entrance to the compartment. He looked at me with his mismatched eyes, and he smiled, and there was something in that smile that might have been pride or might have been pity. "Welcome, Ganger Hale," he said. "The ship has given you a gift. Use it well." I asked him what the gift was, and he gestured to the compartment, to the riggers who watched me with expressions ranging from hope to fear to exhaustion. "The gift of knowledge," he said. "You know what the ship is. You know what it does. And now you can choose whether to prepare them or let them discover it on their own. That is the only real choice any ganger has." He left, and I entered the compartment, and I looked at the 16 faces watching me, waiting for me to speak, to give orders, to offer some reassurance that their service would be rewarded and their sacrifices would be honored. I could have told them the truth. I could have explained about the shift cycles, about the ossuary, about the bodies in the walls and the breathing in the vents, and the fact that the ship consumed everyone who served it. I could have given them the litany of submission and told them to memorize it, to keep it close, to prepare for the moment when they would need it, but I did not. I gave them the same speech Volk had given me, the same warnings about respecting the machine spirit, the same instructions about learning the rhythms of the deep decks, the same promises that if they worked hard and kept faith, they would survive. I lied to them, because that is what gangers do, because the truth would break them before the ship had a chance to, and because I had learned that survival in the deep decks required a capacity for self-deception that I had not possessed when I arrived, but which I had cultivated over the months of service. The days continued. The shifts cycled. The ship patrolled its assigned sector, and I taught my riggers to crawl through conduits and seal pressure leaks and replace blown relays, and I watched them grow tired and worn and marked by the deep decks, and I waited for the next warp transit. It came on what I believe was my 309th day of service, though by then I had stopped counting with any precision, had stopped trusting the chronometers, had stopped believing that time in the deep decks bore any relation to time anywhere else. The ship entered the warp, and the shift cycles began, and my riggers looked to me with fear in their eyes, and I told them that this was normal, that the ship was dreaming, that we would endure. And some of them did endure, and some of them disappeared, and I added their names to the list I kept in my journal, the list of those the ship had claimed, and I continued my shifts, and I continued my service, and I continued my slow consumption by the vast and ancient machine that had become my entire world. I am writing this now in a moment of clarity, in a rest period between shifts, in the compartment where my riggers sleep and where the walls breathe and where the cables pulse with bioluminescent light. I do not know how much longer I will remain myself, how much longer I will remember that there was a time before the glory of Sol, a time when I was not a component in its vast mechanism. But I know this: life aboard an Imperial Navy warship is not service, it is not duty, it is not honor, it is slow consumption, a gradual absorption into a machine that has learned to sustain itself on the bodies and minds and souls of those who crew it. The ship is alive, in a way that defies all understanding, and it is hungry, and it will never stop feeding. We who serve in the deep decks are not crew, we are fuel, we are memory. We are the synapses in a vast mechanical brain, firing and dying and being replaced, over and over, until the ship itself dies, or until the Imperium collapses and there is nothing left but the cold dark between the stars. I have submitted, I have recited the litany, and when my time comes, when the ship finally claims me completely, I hope that I will go swiftly, that I will not end up in the ossuary, that I will not be preserved in some half-living state for centuries to come. But I do not believe that hope will be honored. The glory of Sol does not forget, it does not forgive, it does not release, and I am marked and I am owned. And when I die, I will become another body in the walls, another whisper in the vents, another ghost haunting the corridors for the next generation of riggers who will crawl through the darkness and pretend that this is service. This is what life is like inside an Imperial Navy warship. This is the truth they do not tell you in the scholar, the truth that lives beneath the propaganda and the anthems and the promises of glory. You are not serving the Emperor, you are feeding a machine, and the machine is always hungry. I have 16 riggers under my command. I have taught them to survive. I have lied to them about the nature of their service, and when the next warp transit comes, I will watch some of them disappear, and I will add their names to the list, and I will continue, because that is what gangers do, because the ship demands it, because I have submitted. The litany is in my pocket. The parchment is worn from repeated handling, the words fading but still legible. I recite it every night, every morning, every time I feel the walls beginning to close around me. It is my only prayer now, my only comfort. I submit to the glory of Sol. I submit to its will and its needs. I offer myself willingly, without reservation, without fear. The ship breathes around me. The cables pulse. The bodies in the walls turn their heads to watch me pass, and I continue my shifts, because there is nothing else to do, because service is all that remains, because I am part of the machine now, and the machine will not let me go. This is life aboard an Imperial Navy warship. This is the reality beneath the glory. This is the truth. And the Emperor, if he is watching, if he cares, does not protect us from this. He cannot. Or perhaps he simply chooses not to, because we are expendable, because the Imperium needs its warships more than it needs the souls of those who crew them, because the machine is more valuable than the fuel that powers it. I do not hate him for this. I do not blame him. I simply understand, with a clarity born of exhaustion and horror and resignation, that my life was never my own, that it belonged to the Imperium from the moment the tithe-takers came for me, and that the glory of Sol is simply claiming what was always rightfully its. The shift bell is ringing, my riggers are waking. Another cycle is beginning, and I will rise from my bunk, and I will gather my tools, and I will descend into the deep decks, and I will perform my duties, because that is what I am, because that is all I am, because the ship demands it. The glory of Sol sails on through the void, carrying its cargo of the living and the dead, and I sail with it, and I will sail with it, until the day the ship decides it has taken enough from me and folds me into its walls and keeps me there forever. Another memory in its vast and hungry consciousness, another whisper in the vents for the next generation to ignore. This is service, this is duty, this is life inside an Imperial Navy warship, and it will never end.